All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of The Big Ben Show. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can follow us on X and on Instagram at Big Ben Show Fox. I hope that you'll rate, review, subscribe, and share this podcast with friends. We have been so gratified to see so many people who have been interacting and sharing our content of late. Really appreciate you for listening. Today we have a special edition of The Big Ben Show, one in which we talk about things that are a little outside the normal pattern for us when it comes to discussions here. And that's, of course, two of the things that you will be enjoying, I hope, over the course of the next couple of days. Good food and football. And I want to talk particularly about the football aspect of this because I had the experience recently of flying to a first in terms of the football experience, and that was a football game in Madrid, Spain, that was hosted there by technically the Miami Dolphins, with the Washington Commanders coming as sacrificial lambs across the way. It was an interesting experience for a number of different reasons, but it also, I think, gave an opportunity to see how much the NFL is interested in essentially becoming the major export of the United States when it comes to culture and sports. We've seen in recent years, and particularly in this year, the mantra of Hollywood that was survive till 25, ultimately just crash and burn. There's been such a decline in the effectiveness of cultural exports that come from Hollywood that we've now reached a point where it is relatively routine for weeks to go by without any major movie release, where you have a downfall in the box office numbers that just seems truly unprecedented, and the release of movies and TV shows that really, even if they get all the discussion within the context of, the cultural, signifiers of things that are interesting, if they have all the promotion that you could possibly imagine, they still don't actively connect with any of the kind of people that they used to, and they don't occupy the same level in terms of power of cultural resonance that we used to see in the past, where America ruled the world when it came to this type of thing. Now, are we still the best at it? Sure, by comparison. I spoke to many people in Spain who all cited cultural signifiers from America as being the things that they watched the most. People who are fans of the Taylor Sheridan universe and its expanded properties stretch all the way to Madrid and Barcelona. But it's one of these things where I think in the gap that's been created by the lack of resonance from these typical cultural signifiers, we see sports more and more stepping into the fray and basically being the export, or trying to be the export, that we have around the world. I think, though, that this is not going to work, mostly because there's so many different cultural gaps that exist between the way that people view sports overseas, the way that they view the NFL, the way that it's essentially considered a lark, an exhibition, something that people just check out because of the oddity of it or because of the spectacle, as opposed to becoming passionate fans. There are exceptions to this. There are passionate fan bases, particularly in London, but also in Mexico City and elsewhere. But the NFL really does want to reach a point under Commissioner Roger Goodell where we have effectively international games every week, and perhaps multiple of them. And the discussion is active about whether that would include expansion of franchises, potentially London, Mexico City, and elsewhere around the world that they have designs on in order to try to get money. And that is what this is all about. I attended a corporate NFL event that included a number of different European and American officials, including Europeans who work for the NFL in terms of advancing their cause overseas. And the discussion was about shared values and community and coming together. And money was not the thing that they wanted to mention, which is what this is all about. There were people kitted out at the game in Madrid that were wearing full-on gear as if they had been lifelong Kansas City fans who had purchased it in the last week. And that's the type of experience that leads to clashes inevitably between people who are actual fans of a sport and the people who are just there for the spectacle. I had the good fortune to sit next to a very nice and happy Miami Dolphins fan who was served in the military and is based in Germany, and she would be passionately standing up and shouting at the field when various plays were happening, and she was convinced for most of the game that head coach Mike McDaniel would find a way to bollocks the whole thing up. And try as he might, he failed in that endeavor. This is one of the things that created tension, though, with the fans who were behind us, who were wearing Bengals gear for whatever reason, as they got very frustrated with the fact that we and most of the rest of the people in our section close to the field would stand up when interesting things would happen, to the point that they started poking her in the back and telling her to sit down, whereupon I discovered that they really did not know anything about football and were just there for the ride. I think that this is going to create tension regardless of whether you're able to have real fan bases emerge, as they have in some of the places where these teams have played. There are already announcements going up for next year in terms of the international series. There's going to be a game played by the Saints in Paris, and there's a real interest in expanding this game. But I think that as long as the fan bases have completely different expectations for what's going to go on in the game, there's going to be problems. When you're running out of beer by halftime, when you have people who are posting some of the ridiculous things that were on purchase for concessions, when you have people being genuinely confused about the patterns, rules, and things that are happening in the game. And most of all, when you have a stadium that is run so poorly that routinely plays that were happening actively, critical plays even, had crowd shots on the Jumbotron and music playing over them as the actual play was going on. Maybe there's just a learning curve. But from my perspective, the NFL is going to remain an American sport. And as much as it is going to be exported overseas and find, I think, some purchase there, it is going to be an oddity. There is just something fundamentally different there in terms of the American fan reaction that you can see at college games all across the country on Saturdays, that you can see in many NFL team franchises that have loyal fan bases, that I think just really will not be able to export themselves into the European mindset and experience without some major changes in behavior. And I think that's a good thing. The NFL should stay American as much as possible, and you should not have a Super Bowl in Europe. I'm Ben Domenech. You're listening to another edition of The Big Ben Show. We'll be back with more from Seth Wickersham and from Christopher Kimball right after this. And we're back on The Big Ben Show. Happy to be joined today by Seth Wickersham. He is an ESPN senior writer, New York Times bestselling author of the book American Kings, a biography of the quarterback. This is not just, I want to be clear, a good sports book. It's a good book to read even if you are not interested in sports. Of course, that's probably not going to include many people who listen to us, but if you, for some reason, are not at all interested in football, you will still find this book interesting, well-written, and fascinating, I think, not just as a book about quarterbacking, but about history. I want to open by asking you this. How much of this is something that is motivated by your own personal experience and your own sort of fondness for the experience of playing quarterback yourself? An opportunity to kind of look back on why that's still something you think about.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And, look, I played quarterback a little bit in high school, and I'm in Anchorage, Alaska, and I try really hard to not come off like the Alaska Uncle Rico, but it still kind of slips out in moments. And I think that the book isn't about me and my morass as a quarterback, but I think that it's thematically inspired by it. That's what I would say. It's just, the book is about a handful of guys that I felt gave me the best chance to tell the biggest story about quarterbacking that I possibly could, guys who were both living and no longer with us. But I mean, I played quarterback long enough to know that it's not something that you just do. It's almost like a lifestyle, and it's very unique in that regard. It's a very unique job in sports. I mean, there's no other sport, there's no other job that has all of the requirements that you need to do it well. At one point I asked Steve Young, the Hall of Famer from the 49ers, what are all the hats you have to wear as a starting quarterback in the NFL? And, he starts rattling off, field general, matinee idol, spokesperson for a multi-billion-dollar organization, amateur psychologist, chief cheerleader, breathtaking asshole, all of these things. And, no other job in sports has that many demands on it. And oh, by the way, you also have to be able to throw the ball through windows that most people can't exploit, much less even see. So, I think that was the thing that I tried to attack at it. I wanted to know what it built in these people and what it stripped away.
How often do you listen to the Fountains of Wayne song, All Kinds of Time?
Too often.
That's what it kept just going through my head as I was reading your book.
No, that's a really astute point, and no one's really brought that up. But like there's a part of me that's like, what would life have been like if I would have been an NFL quarterback? And, I wanted to show it through the handful of characters that I picked, both the, amazingly transcendent and fun moments, and also the dangerous and, the moments that almost broke these guys.
There are little elements of history, and I think of myself as being, an above average student of the game, that you highlight that were either on the edge of my cognizance or something that I just didn't even know about. You have a description of Archie Manning playing in the first nationally televised night game in college football history. Archie threw for 436 yards, ran for 104 more, accounting for 5 touchdowns in a 1-point loss in what is now considered one of the greatest games of all time. He cried when the game ended. That's the kind of thing where I knew on some level that was something that happened, but you have over and over moments like that you find about the stories and the lives of these quarterbacks. There was all sorts of stuff about Warren Moon that I didn't know anything about in this. Mm-hmm. This kind of a lifelong endeavor in the sense that you were collecting these anecdotes over the years as being, that's something that I want to go back to because it tells something interesting about the task of being a quarterback or what it takes to be it and do it well.
Yeah. And that's great. Being a Mississippi kid like yourself, I think that like he was just, you grew up obviously knowing him and knowing his importance in that state. So look, this is wild, but I've been at ESPN for 25 years now, and I've mostly covered the NFL. I do a lot of investigative stuff, but when you write about the NFL, you end up writing a lot about quarterbacks. And so I think that like a couple years ago, I just finished my first book on the New England Patriots, and I thought that I knew my next book was going to be on quarterbacks. And I thought that even after all I had done, there was a big story that I had yet to tell. And so what I did was, there was a couple moments that, I had witnessed throughout the years that I was like, okay, that can live in a book. But I really started from scratch, and I went through every quarterback who's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, every quarterback who's in the College Football Hall of Fame, and then other ones that I just thought mattered, even if they weren't Hall of Famers, like, Michael Vick or whoever, some of these guys who were big culturally. And then, I went through their stories. I read a ton on them, and I developed this book. My friends called it like the quarterback Bible. I should probably just sell it. Maybe it'd be like good reading for people, but I just kind of assembled this, and at the end of the day, I had to be ruthless about picking my characters. And so I wanted characters that I either felt like their story itself was fascinating, and I couldn't tell the story of quarterback without telling their story, whether it's Warren Moon or John Elway or, Joe Namath, or they had to be, people who were in interesting situations, like Arch Manning as a way to tell the story of the Mannings, and this kid Colin Hurley, who's at LSU, who, wanted to be the most precocious quarterback ever. Those were kind of the bars that I tried to set because, it's a big undertaking, like trying to write, what I hope is like, the best book ever about this really nuanced and interesting job that's been written about a lot is a big undertaking. And so those were the ways that I tried to kind of narrow it down. And there were moments throughout the years that I ended up using, but in different contexts than when like I had originally written about them.
The a running theme that you have in this book that crops up again and again is something that you have in here summarized as too much daddy or not enough.
Yeah. You're the first person. Yeah, you're the first person to mention that. I'm so glad.
So, well, no, I think it's a fascinating theme.
Yeah.
What does each do? What does each side, in your experience, having looked at so many of these cases, do to the nature of how quarterbacks approach their job?
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea behind that was that like there's a running kind of joke in the football world that most quarterbacks can be broken down to either having too much daddy in their lives or not enough. So they're either trying to live up to expectation or trying to fill some sort of hole. And the book is and I would say moms are part of that too now. But the book is, I think, part of an exploration about, you know, what it takes to survive going from a high school kid to the NFL. And then, of course, what it takes to survive the NFL. But like, no one tells you how to do it. And so the dads, especially the dads, but moms too, but they end up taking on this huge outsized role because all they see are ways that their kid's dream can be derailed, whether it's agents or coaches or, whatever it might be. There's just, danger, temptation, there's just a ton of dangerous things that can happen on that road. And so they're trying to kind of like serve as a lead blocker. And, I get into John and Jack Elway, Archie and Eli Manning, Caleb and Carl Williams, and Charlie and Colin Hurley, again, the kid at LSU. And I kind of try to show, I think we all think of the quarterback dad as being this kind of oppressive, controlling, you know, person who is like a gatekeeper to the kid. And there's definitely moments like that. I will say there's definitely moments like that. But more often than not, the premonitions that they have end up coming to fruition. So like, for instance, I wrote, some news from the book came out about Carl and Caleb Williams and how when he was entering the draft, they wanted to try to figure out a way to, give him some agency over his employer. Like they wanted him to go to a good situation rather than a bad team. And even though he didn't end up blowing up the draft, they thought about it for a long time. And, you could see from his rookie year, just all of the things that his dad worried about like all the ways that a franchise can kind of ruin a quarterback almost happen. And, fortunately they were able to, get a good coach in and some better talent in this year. And you start to see some glimpses of what he can do. But, those things matter. And I think that like, even though there's agents and coaches, the dads end up taking on this kind of outsized role. It's also really
There's
expensive. I mean, I
Yeah.
talk about like the quarterback kind of the youth quarterback industrial complex. And, if one of these quarterback gurus tells a dad that your kid is special, I mean, the dad will hand over the credit card and spend huge amounts of money in that
All my money.
investment. Yes.
um, there's obviously an element of enormous, world granting success to the people who succeed in this line of work and become not just figures who inhabit the world of sports, but figures who dominate every Sunday, whether they're playing or not. The Mannings
Mm-hmm.
obviously fall into that category now. But this is also a career that is marked by tragedy and by missed opportunity or by just the bad situation or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Being a fan who has experienced that for Washington over the last several decades, again and again, you saw quarterbacks who ran into these things. The example who actually comes to mind for me in that context is Patrick Ramsey and his career being derailed by going to
Yeah.
a team with Steve Spurrier that just could not use any of the old school stand in the pocket like a statue, just throw it a really long way type of approach.
Yeah.
But the thing that I wanted to ask you about that is for most of the tragic experience, how do the quarterbacks who go through that and come out at the end not having one, since most of them don't, the big one ever, how do they deal with that? How do they look back on their careers? And is it motivated more in your experience by bitterness, or is it something that they're still happy with on some level just because they played the game at a level that no one else really gets to?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like that's a fascinating question. And I think that there's a hole that will always kind of be unfilled in their personality. I think that like, it's one thing to throw a football better than 95% of the people who ever do it, and then 97, and then 98. But after you get to that level, it's really difficult. And I do, try to write about the differences between the people who make it and don't, and why. And it's a huge mystery. And I think that like one of the most interesting things, and I think that like in the political world, there are some parallels, is that like I think that like sometimes self-awareness can be a virtue, and also it can be a little bit of a weight that these guys carry around. I think that like look, to be a quarterback in the NFL, you have to be incredibly selfish. You have to be incredibly self-motivated, and you can't really concern yourself with anything else. And so I think that like to enter a field on Sundays without feeling any doubt it takes a lot of mental energy, and takes your mind in some dark places to get there. And I think that similar to the political world, I think that like there's an aloofness or a detachment from reality that can obviously like help a lot of these guys. And where I think a lot of the quarterbacks who just came up just a little bit short often wonder if like maybe they were a little too self-aware, and it would have been a little easier on them if like they had been more aloof, more arrogant, and more kind of willing to accept that they're special. I think it's a really fascinating psychological exercise.
How do you categorize that tier of quarterbacks? And it's really not fair to call them backups, because many of them are people who, start frequently or rebuild their careers. You look at Sam Darnold or something like that.
Yeah.
Look at Daniel Jones. That tier of quarterbacks who basically experience early adversity, but become people who fans naturally root for, even if they aren't on the team, just because they like the guy and that it's entertaining, win or lose, And I say this obviously speaking mostly about Jameis Winston, who has never played for any of my teams, but who I find to be just this incredibly entertaining personality. And so whenever he gets a shot, it's just like, I like it. People used to feel that way about Fitzmagic. They used to feel that way about all these guys who it's like, they're not quite good enough, or to really make it, but they occupy a position in people's heart. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that like fans, I think they understand that they're watching people who are supremely gifted and supremely motivated, but they still like having their stories have some sort of connectivity to that guy. And I think that like, context matters, and where you're drafted matters. And when you go to a situation like the Jets or Washington for so long, but like trying to think of other examples, the Browns for a long time, you go to these kind of systemic bad teams where nobody can really succeed in them. And if they get another crack to do it, I think that like they're looser because they've already been fired once. Everybody already thinks they're a bust. So like, what do they have to lose? And obviously people can relate with the second chance and the opportunity to kind of, maybe things didn't work out exactly perfectly the first time, but coming around the second time. But you're right. And it's like Baker Mayfield's like another one of those guys where it's like, this is what makes this job so different from everything else, is that like that moxie and that personality has such a chance to live and breathe and become part of the zeitgeist and part of the fan experience in a way that I don't think it does for a lot of other positions.
I don't know if you saw this graphic, but I think a perfect example of what you're talking about is that we are speaking on the first day that Matthew Stafford is above 500 for his career.
I didn't know that. Oh my God.
He's like 116 and 115 and 1 or something like that.
That's astounding.
And it's just like, man, that's how bad those Detroit teams were. That's why, you have these guys who just conquer that type of adversity, and you can't, I'm sure. Let me just put it this way. I think if Baker had gone to a good situation to start with, I think he'd have fewer fans than he does today, because he had that kind of terrible experience and everything else that came out of it. I wonder, in terms of the way that you watch quarterbacks play, if writing this book changed anything about the way that you see them.
It really did. And so I think that like this is so I met with Kevin O'Connell for the book, and he's the head coach of the Vikings. He was coach of the year last year, and he was a great quarterback in college. I think he was a 4-year starter and 4-year captain. He's like a mid-round pick in the NFL by the Patriots. And he figures he'll go and sit behind Tom Brady for a couple years, take what he's learned, and be great somewhere else. And his career really, he got cut by the Patriots a year after he was picked, and he could never hang on really in another job. I mean, his career was almost over before it had a chance to start. And with each tryout, he tried harder and harder to make that Patrick Mahomes throw, that Josh Allen throw, that John Elway type of throw that has like the wow factor to it, right? And when he became a coach, he went back and looked at all of Joe Montana's game-winning drives in big games, all of Tom Brady's, John Elway's to a certain extent. And what stood out wasn't that they made those kind of wow factor throws, but instead that they kind of like had a mastery of the mundane. If you go back and look at like Joe Montana's game-winning drive against the Bengals in Super Bowl 23, almost every play is a check down. Like, quarterbacks always talk about being like a check down Charlie, how they don't want to get labeled as that. And yet that's what he does. If you look at Tom Brady's first game-winning drive in the Super Bowl against the Rams, almost everything is a dump off to the running back. And then there's just one play that's kind of like a big play that moves, that accelerates the drive. And I think when Kevin O'Connell like got into coaching, he understood that like what separated the guys who were the best was that they did the really kind of simple, well, we call it simple, but really kind of like the easiest throws at an extremely high level in the biggest moments. And that was the thing that stood out. And so now when I watch games, I'm almost like, you have these 2-minute drives. I'm almost like just looking for the running back because I'm expecting to see whether like that guy gets the ball or not. It's really, that to me was a really fascinating thing because we're so prone to mythologizing it and overthinking it and looking at these guys as playing 3-dimensional chess all the time when really they're pragmatists at heart, the best ones.
The best ones, definitely. And I say that as someone who got to root for both Rex Grossman and Taylor Heineke in the last 10 years. So
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. We'll see if I congratulate on all the other top quarterback draftees from last year on having 2 working arms with their quarterbacks. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes for us going forward. I do want to ask you about that draft class. Obviously, you were writing this book. And you have the focus that's on Caleb, in this book, which is fascinating. But we've seen this class now have some really different outcomes and some really different circumstances, but all be good in a surprisingly different set of ways. And you look at them in their current situations: Bo Nix, Drake May, Caleb, Jaden. It seems to me that these guys are all playing in circumstances where they're being asked to do different things. Who do you think has the hardest job out of the 5 of them right now? And who do you think is best set in terms of the type of team that's around him, the type of stuff that he has to work with, the organization to have early success? The
class of 24 quarterbacks. That's a great question. I mean, I think that clearly they're all dealing with things, but on a different level. Like I think as a rookie, Caleb probably had the hardest job because he went to a disastrous team and every fear he had was realized. And Jaden went to a good situation where he had an established head coach, a really smart offensive mind calling plays, and then they got hot. And now I think I would look at I think that JJ McCarthy is in a really tough spot. Michael Penance is in a really tough spot because they're struggling with injuries. And they haven't had a chance.
I said 5. I should have said 6. But I almost take McCarthy off of that list because of not even having a season. Though obviously he clearly was working behind the scenes with O'Connell.
Totally, and you can see that he's pressing and that he's feeling the pressure because all of these other guys are having good seasons. The team expects to make the playoffs like they did a year ago, and he just hasn't had enough time to learn how to do this. And I think that we all fall in love with the instant success stories of Dan Marino and Jaden Daniels, but the NFL is still a developmental league and guys aren't they don't always end up leaving as how they came in. And so I think that like when I look at like who's in the toughest situation right now, I would go with McCarthy. I think, Bo Nix is, he's going through those growing pains too, but they're winning and he's come alive in the fourth quarter in a way that's pretty special. So I think that, but that team, he helped that team get to the playoffs last year and end a long drought. And now they're thinking Super Bowl. So that's a whole different kind of pressure on him, but I would probably put it on those two.
Is Joe Flacco elite?
Oh gosh, man. Is this like my phone?
I think I'm
up?
sorry, but you're positioned better than any sports writer to answer that question.
I mean, I think that he's interesting because, like, I would say over the course of a career, you couldn't say he was an elite quarterback his entire career, but he had these astoundingly elite moments. And I think that like what's interesting now, watching him, look, when they won the Super Bowl, he came alive when it mattered most. He had a big arm, made that big throw against the Broncos. And now when you look at him, he kind of reminds me of someone who's like, you travel a lot, for instance, like, so you get in a lot of different rental cars, right? And so you're always constantly trying to figure out what makes each type of car different. But once you figure it out, you have a pretty good sense of how to drive. And I think that like that's him with quarterbacking right now, as he goes to all these different teams, learns the offense, which is like a little bit different in each place. But once he's on the field, he kind of just knows how to drive. And it's really kind of fun and cool to watch because there's a calmness with which he approaches the job that I think is really rare. And, if I'm a football fan, you want to watch that because that takes a long time to earn. And so that part of it's cool. But like, is he elite? I mean, man, is he and Matt, like the question with Matt Ryan and Joe Flacco, are they elite? They kind of invented that question, right? Nobody was ever asking if Warren Moon was elite. I would have to say that like over the course of their career, it's hard to say that they were great every single year, but like,
I appreciate you taking my joke question and answering it seriously.
Well, I have friends who will listen to this and they'll be like, how could you punt on that?
So I want to close out by asking you a question about sports writing.
Yeah.
When I grew up, I was reading ESPN the magazine. I was reading Sports Illustrated. I was reading all these great sports writers in all sorts of different veins. I was reading the nerdy ones like Bill James, and then I was reading the guys who would just inject drama and bring out the kind of cultural resonance of things, and I loved it. In this era of media, does the sports writer still have any hope really of relevance? Not in the sense of something like this, which is obviously a bestseller that hit so many people and hits. I think every fan who cares about the NFL should get it. But it's one of the things that I really miss is being able to read that type, the sports writer who both captures the drama of the moment, but also has the type of personal insights into what's really going on with a player that you care about or a team that you care about in ways that are more illuminating than, I'm having a conversation with you as part of a network that, does cable news. Your own network is the worldwide leader. This isn't the stuff that necessarily gets on in front of cameras. It's not the type of thing that you can do there. And so I miss that element of sports writing that used to be a regular part of the life of a season. And I just wonder, do you think that there's hope for that to make a comeback, or are we just destined to have, here's one more segment where we debate the over-under?
Yeah. Well, I think that, man, it's a terrific question. And I know exactly the visceral emotional feeling that, you talk about when, I think that like what's happened clearly is that like it used to be that being a columnist at a major city was something that it took you a long time to get to. And that table of having an opinion is so much more crowded now. And so I think that like the premium is placed on, reporting, on inside details and, on storytelling. I do think that like, I think that what you're talking about is possible, but like it obviously is more fragmented than it used to be. But I grew up a Denver Broncos fan. I remember, waiting for Sports Illustrated to come so that I could read about, just a different experience of what happened in that Sunday's game. And that has changed quite a bit, but I don't think it's like gone forever. I think that it's just harder to do now. And the people who do it well, and I do think there are some people out there who do it well, you have to work harder to do it. But, you have to adapt and you have to kind of serve readers in different ways. But yes, I do think that like there's still a place and there will be still a place for that 1,000 words off of a game that really take you to, give you 10 minutes throughout your day that you don't have to think about anything else.
Well, it is, I think, a wonderful thing when you can find it, and your book is absolutely full of it, and it helps you understand the characters, the figures themselves as human beings, and I really appreciate you taking all the time that you did to write it. The book is American King, is a biography of the quarterback. You can follow Seth Wickersham on X at Seth Wickersham, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join the Big Ben Show today, and good luck with this book. I hope that people. I know that people have been buying it, but I hope that it really sticks for a lot of folks. And it's one of these ones that I think will help them understand more about such a critical position in sports.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate it.
We'll be back with more of the Big Ben Show right after this. I'm happy to welcome to the Big Ben Show Christopher Kimball, the founder of Milk Street. You can find their recipes, videos, books, and more at 177milkstreet.com. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. We've had these kind of annual or semi-annual conversations before about the way that people cook for their families, the way that people do holidays and the like. And I have to start with a very specific and troublesome question for me, which is that I learned within the last 36 hours that my wife had changed her mind about what we were going to do for Thanksgiving from something where we were going to stay home and then go to a hotel or something like that for the weekend to one where she wants to go to a cabin. And I have to figure out how to bring and how to cook Thanksgiving dinner there in pretty short order. What's your advice, especially and just consider the factor that she is 8 months pregnant. So no is not a possible answer to this question.
Well, my first question is, how did she get? Well, my first question is, when you say cabin, do you mean like a hunting cabin with no electricity, or do you mean a cabin with a kitchen, running water? I mean, it's a functional house.
It is a functional house. We've been there. Okay. We've stayed there once before. It's a perfectly fine Airbnb. I'm not sure I trust the oven just to retain the level of heat necessary that I would like, but otherwise it's perfectly capable of doing something. My recollection is that I made pasta there and some other things the last time that we were there, and it was fine.
That's a long way from cooking a full Thanksgiving dinner.
Oh yes, very
boiling water. Now you got a turkey, you got pies, you got mashed potatoes. Well, I give you some advice. I mean, first of all, there's only one oven, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's not great. I would plan the meal around one oven, which means bring a slow cooker or an Instant Pot with you. You can do a lot of stuff. I have those. And I would also plan around the stove top rather than the oven. So you can't have 3 casseroles and a turkey in one oven. It's not going to work out too well. And finally, I would super simplify the menu. I mean, I would triage, take half the stuff off.
Yes.
And do as much as you can ahead of time. Like if you're going to make, I don't know if you make pie, but make the pie dough ahead of time. Do as much as you can. How much you getting there the day before Thanksgiving, or?
Yes.
Yeah, I would prep in your normal kitchen everything.
Yeah, and just to give it perspective on this, when I'm cooking at home, I've done it so many times, and we have 2 ovens and we have 2 refrigerators and we have, it's much easier to prep. But I do want to try to make this work, and I can simplify the menu because it would just be cooking for my immediate family. We wouldn't have guests coming over and that kind of thing. So it's certainly possible because it's not as if.
Well, there's another opportunity, which is just completely massacre the meal and then she won't want to go back to the cabin next year. I'm crash and burn the whole thing.
No,
Uh,
it's prove that you're terrible at something, so you're
yeah,
never asked to do it again.
that location is no longer on the list. I mean, what's true is, and I know this from a lot of experience, people don't miss what they weren't served. I mean,
Mhm.
even at Thanksgiving, you can cut things way back. So you don't need all the extra stuff. For me, to be honest, for Thanksgiving is about white and brown foods,
Mhm.
gravy, stuffing, turkey. I don't really want green vegetables. Thank you very much. Mashed potatoes, you know, a little orange in the pumpkin pie, but the apple
Mhm.
pie. So I always find there's too much there anyway.
Yeah.
So you're not going to miss what you don't make. So
Also, the other thing is that if when I'm cooking at home, I do actually care a lot about presentation and things like that, just because, friends are coming over, things like that. Everybody wants to take a picture and put it on Instagram. I don't do that, but they do. And cooking in a cabin, it's more like, okay, let's just get the things on sufficient plates to be able to share. And that does, I think, take it back a little bit. What would you advise when it comes to the bird?
well, I mean, you could get a big 6 pound chicken, if you
Mhm.
wanted to, but I know that's not satisfying. I would dry brine it. I
Yeah.
wouldn't wet brine it, which means salt, sugar. We use a little buttermilk powder, mixed in. Put that under the skin and on top of the skin. Let it sit in the refrigerator, uncovered overnight. And I find you get better texture because I think wet brining, the meat tends to be too wet.
Mhm.
And I don't like the texture. The texture is too soft. So a dry brine that's koshering essentially is
Yeah.
better. That's what I would do. You could also, uh, we milk simmer our potatoes for mashed potatoes with
Hmm.
water and milk in them, which is kind of nice. And then you add butter at the end. Um, but I would probably essentially kosher the bird, which is
Mhm.
much easier than getting a big, beer chest and water and salt and everything. Yeah.
So
Or you could do you could go get, a butterball turkey, which is probably injected with a saline solution to start with, and cook it at 325 for 2.5, 3 hours till it's done, and then you don't have to do anything.
I have been dry brining my birds for years and switching it around a little bit, but I haven't done buttermilk powder before. What does it do to the bird?
The lactic acid makes the meat fibers positive in charge, and positives uh, repulse each other. So the proteins, the fibers start to loosen up, and there's a lot of room in there for water. So as it roasts, it retains water, similar to the salt, right? Salt does something similar. So it's like salt, it's just another way of doing it. So the meat proteins pull apart, the water will get trapped in there, and you'll get less drying out. I mean, it's not a night and day difference. The salt's doing most of the work, but it adds a little bit. It's also you get a little bit better browning. The other thing we did this year was after an hour and a half at 325, take equal parts soy sauce and brush the bird. Put it back in for half an hour, take it out, brush it again, put it back in until it's done. And you get this incredible, almost Peking duck kind of glaze on the outside. So
Mhm.
that's super simple too.
The approach to cooking turkey, obviously, people have their own different methods of it. Uh, are you a big believer in breaking the bird apart if you can, as opposed to having to deal with cooking it all at once and just
Yeah,
that
well,
potbelly and
first of
texture?
all, I've cooked over 45 years. I've tried 45 different techniques. So, chicken, I actually do that. I'll take the legs off and cook the breast and the legs separately, and then take the breast out. And you want to cook the heck out of the legs, like up to 200 degrees, right? To dissolve all that connective tissue and tendons, etc.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have braised a bird where I took the whole breast off, and then put the legs down into the braising liquid, put the breast on top. When the breast was ready, took that off, and then continue cooking the leg meat. The problem is breast is 165. The dark meat's going to get to 175, 180. That's not high enough to melt all the tendons and sort of that
Mm.
questionable stuff in the legs, etc. So you really want to cook that dark meat to like 200, really, or more, 205. So that's not a bad suggestion. Yeah.
Is there a way to do that with just in terms of ramping it up after you take the breast out or something like that to get to that stage, or is it hard to execute?
If the bird is whole, I've tried, upside down, right side up, high
Yep.
temperature, low temperature. I've tried that. No, that doesn't work. You still
Yeah.
can't get the dark meat up to a high enough temperature. So you're going to have to cut out the breast, the whole breast separately, and then you can take the breast out when it's done, and then finish cooking the legs. It doesn't matter if you increase the temperature; it'll eventually get there anyway.
Mhm.
You can also there's another way to do it. You can spatchcock it, like
Yep.
cut out the backbone, right? Flip it over, press it down, cook that in a 450 or 425 oven, and a 14-pound bird will take about 2 hours. You have to dry brine it the night
Yeah.
before, wet brine it. But the spatchcocking does a better job of equalizing temperatures because in a whole bird, the breast is exposed to
Yeah.
the heat, and the dark meat tends to cook a little slower. So spatchcocking for chicken or turkey works great.
Mhm. You, I don't know if you've done 45 different methods of cooking stuffing, but do you have a preferred method or ingredient that you use for it, or is it mostly just based on sage
Yeah, I
and the
think
normal
stuffing
stuff?
is one of those things you don't even need a recipe. I mean, the one
Yeah.
thing you want to remember is the cavity inside the bird is not large enough to hold enough stuffing. So
No.
you need a big 9 by 13 casserole dish, and make sure it's there's enough chicken stock in there to keep it moist when you cook it. But it's just a choice if you could use rice or a grain or bread or cornbread, whatever the base is. You actually have the herbs, you have celery, etc. You can do anything. You can put oysters in it, whatever. So I like a basic. Actually, I like the classic bread stuffing. I
Mhm.
don't know why. It's one of those things that I'm used to because that's how I grew up. Um, well, my mother was also really good at undercooking turkey, so that I don't like. But the stuffing was fine. And cornbread stuffing is another winner. But you could do rice, you could do anything. It's really not hard.
Mhm. The one of the latest videos that you have on Milk Street is about what everybody gets wrong about pie. So circling back to the pie
Mm.
question, what are some of the approaches that people get wrong when it comes to
Do
uh,
I have
you
a
know,
couple hours on this podcast to kind of go ahead?
you
Okay.
can go along with this answer.
Well,
Pie is very important to me.
yeah, Fannie Farmer back in the 1890s, when she talked about making pie, she said she was the one who did this. Cut the butter or whatever, the fat, into the flour until they're pea-sized pieces. That is the worst piece of advice anybody, and she should not go to heaven for this. And the reason is, here's the problem. Most pastries, like in France, they cut the fat all the way in, right? You don't see pieces of butter. It's all the way in. That coats the flour. It makes the dough much easier to work with. It's not going to shrink as much. It's not going to be as tough. American pies pastry, for some weird reason, everyone talks about flaky, right? So bigger pieces of butter, you get longer shards. Well, it makes it hard to roll out, hard to deal with, tougher when you pre-bake it. So cut the butter or the fat or the lard all the way in, totally all the way in to the flour looks mealy. Second thing is everyone's afraid of adding too much water. And they say, well, you add too much water, you have more gluten development. But not really. An extra tablespoon's not going to make a big difference. So make sure you have enough water because if it's too dry and you roll it out, it falls apart. And you head for the bourbon bottle at 10 in the morning on Thanksgiving. It's just not great. The last thing is if you want to pre-bake like you have to for pumpkin pie, for example, you want to make sure that the pie dough is pushed down into the circumference of the pie plate. Put the aluminum foil on, and use enough pie weights to fully fill the pie, not halfway, all the way to the top. And then make sure you don't take the weights and the foil out until the pie dough is actually set. It's not wet, it's dry, and then you can take it out and finish baking it. But it's really the two things: cut the fat all the way in, and make sure you use enough water so the dough is malleable. The last thing is, if you're not used to making pie, do that the day before. You let it sit wrapped in the fridge. It'll hydrate evenly. It'll rest. It's much easier to roll out. But those are just a few of the things. But I don't. Fanny Farmer just went way off the rails here. I don't know. I don't know what she was thinking. So.
Are there other aspects of that are, just in terms of pieces of advice that you regularly hear people recite as if they are, chapter and verse from, something handed down on high by the Almighty, that are nonetheless based on your own experience and based on the science involved, just absolute crap in terms of what people do when it comes to baking, when it comes to cooking something in.
Oh yeah, there's a million things. I mean,
what's one that irritates you the most?
Well, salt. Okay, like people are afraid of salt. 95% of your salt does not come from home cooking. It comes from restaurants or convenience foods, right? So, and a half teaspoon more salt in a dish for six people is meaningless anyway. But even in desserts, like a chocolate cake, you want to add salt. I see a lot of dessert recipes that don't use salt, so you definitely want to use salt. You want to the second thing is you need to vary the heat on the top of the stovetop. So if you're cooking onions, for example, first of all, put them in the pan cold with the oil. Don't heat up the oil first because you can overheat it. Two, you got to listen to it, right? So if it's a nice, gentle sound, you're fine. But what's going to happen is over time, the pan's going to heat up and you'll need to reduce the heat on the stovetop. So don't think that just because it says medium heat, no, you always have to change. And third, never trust baking times. People go, it's 40 minutes in a 350 oven. That is completely useless. So because your oven and the person who developed the recipe's oven are not the same. And your oven could be off 40 degrees. Bake for half the baking time and start checking. Constantly check. And the last thing is this thing about like cakes and things. Oh, two other things. Cakes. The toothpick in the center is not good because there's sometimes you do want a little moistness left on it, like a chocolate cake. You press down the top in the middle. If it bounces back, it's done. Pumpkin pies, custard pies, the center should not be set. The center 2 inches, it should still be unset. Jiggle, take it out. There's going to be cooking outside of the oven as the pie cools. So those are just a few things. But I basically say don't trust a recipe ever. Like you got to assume all the times are wrong. You have to just think, you have to trust yourself a little bit.
There have been, especially I think in the last several years, in part driven by COVID, an explosion in YouTube-based shows done by cooks and chefs of various levels of experience, some of which are very popular and don't have a huge resume behind them, and some of which are less popular but do have a huge resume behind them. And so when I'm cooking something that I haven't cooked before or I haven't cooked in a while, I will sometimes turn to a specific person. Okay, I recall I used this guy's recipe before. I made this slight change to it, but there's a lot of disagreement among them on certain things. You just mentioned, for instance, putting the onions into a cold pan. That's not something. Sometimes you hear the different advice given by different people along these lines. Is there something from that kind of new generation of YouTube fad-based type, presenters? I don't know if you even take the time to look at them, that has caught on that you find to be just at odds with what people should be doing?
Well, first, the good news. There are people out there who are not famous or not on TV shows, have not written cookbooks, who actually are pretty good cooks, like sourdough bakers, for example. There's some people out there who do a very good job. So I think the great thing about social media is there are people out there who are very talented, who know a lot. Like people call into my radio show. Sometimes they call and they know a lot more about their particular area of expertise than I know. So I think that's good. I would say the majority of the time is performance art, right? And so it's not so much about the recipe, it's about what they're doing to be entertaining. And a lot of those recipes probably are not worth making because ultimately it's more about the personality than it is about the food. But, you know, I've seen people do really excellent work who I've never heard of before. And so I don't know, it's definitely hit or miss. But there are some good people out there who are new to, you know, food entertainment, or whatever you want to call it.
I do the ones that I kind of find and that I find I appreciate are actually a ripoff of you because
Oh, well, that's
what
good.
because what it is I'll just use one example. I do enjoy the Binging with Babish program, which again
Yeah.
is about personality more than a lot of other things, and it's even become even more so. But occasionally he will do the thing where he says, "All right, I'm going to try 50 different ways to make
Right.
mac and cheese." And that to me is actually useful because I find, okay, number 18 is actually the one that my kids like or what have you. And is better than the blue box, health wise, but close enough to it that they like it. And that I find to be useful, but also very much in the vein of let's just test this over and over again. Do you think that that's just something that people, should factor into when they're just Googling around and looking for or asking AI, quite frankly, which I've seen people do, to give them recipes that they really should consider if it's been tested against other options?
Yeah, I've used AI a lot, Claude, for example, and it's good for research to see what the possibilities are. Like,
Mhm.
give me 25 recipes for a creme brulee, and then, recipe 18 has kind of a cool technique you might test. But I'd say most of the recipes I get off of that are not great because they have no filter. They have no way of knowing whether it's a good recipe or not. But it's good for researcher coming up with ideas. I think I've been doing this a long time, and I think I'm not looking for the best recipe regardless of number of ingredients or time invested. I'm looking for the recipe that fits my style of cooking the best.
Mhm.
So, if there's a 6 ingredient recipe that takes 20 minutes and there's a 15 ingredient recipe that takes 3 hours, that second one's got to be a lot better than the first one. So I like simplicity and I like good technique, right? Because a lot of times recipes do a lot of things that don't really add that much value, but you're doubling the amount of work. So I really look for simplicity. And the best cooking in the world, or most of it is simple, right?
Mhm.
But you gotta do it right. You gotta have the right technique. But I think simplicity is a bigger part of what I'm looking for than the best, no matter how much time and money you have to put into it.
This is not necessarily a Thanksgiving question, but it is something that people often confront during Thanksgiving. Talk to me about stock. How much importance is making a stock at home versus buying some of these higher end store brand stocks versus maybe some of the tricks that people do with gelatin or otherwise to try to make something that is a lower level quality better? What's your attitude toward stock, especially for those people who aren't going to have a stock pot simmering there
You,
for
you know what makes great
hours?
stuff? Well, first of all, if you go around the world, like in Japan, they have chicken powder. That's how
Yes.
they make their chicken stock. And bouillon cubes are used by half the world and with MSG, and nobody seems to care. I think that better than bouillon, the paste in the jar
Yes.
is actually, they do a good job. And I will use that as a base, assuming there are other things going on.
Mhm.
That's fine.
Yeah.
If the recipe is almost entirely about the stock, like that's 90% of the
No.
deal, then okay. Now the way I do it is I use chicken wings in an instant pot, a pressure cooker, for about 50 minutes, and that makes great stock. You just throw it in with the water, and it's very simple. But I'm not going to go through the gelatin and the whole 9 yards. I mean, look, the French, it made sense for the French to cook stock all day because they had a back burner, right, on their big coal stoves. And they were throwing, cabbage trimmings in there and everything else. And it was fine because somebody was in the kitchen all day and it was a good way of using leftovers, right?
Mhm.
But I'm not going to go brown the bones and the carcass and all that stuff. I'm just not going to go do it. So I would use an Instant Pot chicken wing method, or I would just use better than bouillon as a base. The other thing is, if you poach a chicken in water and then you take it out, you've just made chicken stock.
Mhm.
So you can add a little additional to it, but that's you can cook a chicken, use the meat, and now you also have stock, and that's an easy way to do it.
You have younger kids and older kids.
I have six, yes.
When it comes to the younger age range, how do they eat differently than the older ones do?
Oh my God, this is so embarrassing. I have an 8-year-old and a 8-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter, Oliver and Ricky. Ricky is the more adventurous eater. Like she'll actually eat fish, with something that my son would never do. It drives me crazy. Like all the time, I try to cook for them. I want to get them to eat more things, and it's really hard. I mean, even like steak, like
Yes.
steak. They'll try a piece. Hamburger, they don't even eat hamburger. I'll make a pasta dish. No. So they eat basic, pasta with butter, like every kids do. They'll eat avocado toast, which I
Mhm.
guess that means they're 21st century kids. They'll eat some raw vegetables, but it's occasionally some salmon, a fried, sort of chicken, cutlets. But I'm not having much success. I mean, God forbid I would cook shrimp or something, So
So
it's hard. The only way to do it, and I did this with my older kids, is we make dinner every night, and then if they didn't like it, there wasn't a backup plan. It was fruit, actually. Here's an
mhm,
apple, here's a pear. Fine,
yeah,
you can have fruit for dinner, but you're not getting cereal. You're not getting a grilled
yeah,
cheese. It's like this or nothing, or a
yeah.
simple backup. And I think that's what you have to do because if you give them full range of choice, you know what they're going to go for.
Mhm.
It's the ice cream sandwich in the freezer is where they're headed.
My daughters, we are fortunate enough to have a couple of good sushi places around where we are, and they have cottoned on to uh, sushi
Really?
and particularly sashimi, salmon and yellowtail. They don't like tuna as much, but they requested. They literally had it last night, and they love it and eat the edamame
Could I
and
get your kids to come to my house? Maybe we could.
well, the thing that I was going to say is, I wonder if it's just uh, the one piece of advice that I remember, and I think the original person that I heard say it was Kenji Lopez Alt, but I think it's something that Andrew Gruel, the chef, has had said to me as well, which is never telling them that they won't like something. And
Yeah, that's
that
true.
to me has been key, but I can't get them. There are definitely certain things I cannot get them to like,
Well,
and I
Kenji,
just
I've
don't.
known Kenji for a long time, and he actually brought his daughter to Milk Street a year ago. And he keeps telling me, oh, she eats this and she eats that, and she likes spicy food and she likes Korean food and she likes like Kenji, like, are you making this up, or you just have this extraordinary child who eats everything? I think it's kind of the latter. So he's
Yes.
managed to open up her palate in a way that makes me look like a complete loser. So,
Well, I just think they definitely have different predilections, and so one likes broccoli and one likes tomatoes and that kind of thing. But anyway, I do think it's a real challenge in this day and age, and in part I say that because and I've mentioned this before, we have some close friends who great parents to great little kids, but for one of the boys, they literally have to like bring a bag of frozen chicken nuggets with them everywhere they go because he's
no,
not
that's
going to
not
eat whatever,
that's not
and
good.
that's just not good. Let's talk for a moment about the trends as you see them when it comes to people wanting to get back to cooking more at home after what was a explosion in delivery and DoorDash and everything else that has come during this sort of Uber Eats moment. People in this day and age, I feel like, are finally waking up to how much more expensive it is to do that, and frankly, how much lower quality the food is when it shows up because there's so few things that actually can stand up to that kind of transportation. Um, do you have hope about that, or do you think that for the generation of people who basically came out of high school or college and just had basically a 4-year period almost of just like ordering everything, door dashing everything, that it's going to be really hard to get them back into the kitchen themselves?
Well, I just wrote a piece called Food Wars, and unfortunately, my conclusion was this is this is like the first World War. You got to go for the long term. This is trench warfare,
Mm.
and it's not going to get solved easily. What doesn't work is educating people. Because if you go back and look at cigarettes, where the Surgeon General's warning, none of that helped. It was two things. It was the cost of cigarettes, which got to be $10 a pack with taxes, right? That had probably had the biggest surge in, reducing smoking. And then it was culturally at some point not cool, and that also helped a little bit. So, and you look at the obesity rates,
By the
which
way, it
go,
is cool again. Just
yeah, I know that's true. It is cool again. So maybe
but I would argue
yeah.
partially in response to vaping becoming uncool. so,
Yeah, well,
so it's like
vaping,
a backlash.
one of my kids does that. But anyway, I think the problem is that if you look at the obesity rates, they're going up. So I think you're going to have a bifurcated, population. Some people like you and me, it's not just the food's better. It's not just the food's cheaper, which it is. I mean, you can cook, for $20, you can make a great meal for four.
Right.
But it's what happens to the family when someone's there cooking dinner. I think that's what people overlook. That's the benefit, really. I mean, besides everything else, it's good for the family. It brings people together. Neighbors come over. In Vermont, I spent a lot of time there. I'm always cooking every night. I have people over. It's just a different culture. So that's what interests me the most. But I'm not optimistic that convenience isn't going to win out over making dinner. I think it will for some subset of the population. But if you look at all the statistics, it's not encouraging. So I think you got to take, a 30-year view of this, not a 3-year view, because it's not going to get better anytime soon. And Kenji and I talked about this, and he agrees. It's a real problem because if you can go online, get it delivered versus spending an hour planning it, chopping things. For most people, that's a pretty clear option, for them.
Mhm.
So in the long run, maybe, but for maybe 10 or 15% of the population, cooking has some value beyond the food itself.
I think that one thing that people don't really see is, it's the invisible part of it. It's what you lose by
Yeah.
having that on demand, because that you see
Yeah.
the benefit of it, immediately, the convenience of it. But when I'm away from home I don't, travel for long lengths of time, but sometimes, it's, 4 or 5 days. When I'm away and I come back and the kids, are looking forward to me making them breakfast in the morning, that's something that is a sign that it's more important than just what they're getting.
Yeah, I do on the weekends. Every weekend I make pancakes, waffles, biscuits. It's a thing,
Mhm.
And I think you're right. I think it's a cultural benefit that I think outweighs, well, obviously their health benefits, but people don't talk about it enough. I grew up, I spent a lot of time in Vermont, and there was cooking going on all the time, and it was the center of the community, and I think cooking centers the family. And without it, it's so weird to me. People would live in a house with a kitchen that is it's kind of an empty space,
Yes.
and eating the takeout in the kitchen just doesn't do it. You got to cook. But that's kind of like eat your vegetables, right? It's like that's not an easy message to get across because the other side is much more compelling.
Mhm.
So it's a message I will keep delivering, but I will be happy with small gains, I think, for the short term.
Uh, Not to get too political, but what, from your perspective, when you look at the demands of the so-called Maha movement around preservatives, food dyes, issues like that, do you think that that's a positive development, that something like that has come into the political conversation? Or is there some risk that it's essentially become a monopartisan issue or crossed over into an area where that's associated to a certain extent with one side of the political aisle now, as opposed to being perhaps more broad-based beforehand?
I think it's a ghost issue. I don't think it's a real issue
Mhm.
because you really think that major food manufacturers are going to significantly change what they put in their foods. I mean, I used to spend time in Washington talking to some of these senators about foods and stuff. And I won't mention names, but it was a guy, what great guy from a Midwest state. He just laughed. He said, "Look, you don't understand how this works. Let me explain how it works." So I know enough about the politics of it so that at the end of the day, I don't think there'll be any meaningful changes coming out of this. Look, I think the more meaningful change wouldn't be, are you using artificial dyes in your breakfast cereal? I mean, fine. The real change is, do you care about your health overall? Are you going to take charge of your health? Are you going to eat fresh fruits and vegetables? It's not about whether the processed foods have better ingredients. Processed foods are a problem because they're processed. Even if they're all natural ingredients, you're much better off not eating processed foods. So it's not about the red dye number two as much as it is just eat much less processed food, which is not what that movement seems to be about. It's about the ingredients in processed food. So, and I don't think anything's going to change anyway. I just don't. I'm too, I've been around too long. I don't think, at the end of the day, I don't think that's going to really happen. What would be great is you get back to, what your diet should be. And your diet should be, you should not be eating cereal out of a box in the morning. Let's start with that. And you shouldn't be eating fast food and other things. But, Jamie Oliver, I spoke to a little while ago. He went down to West Virginia, to the town that had the worst obesity rate in the country. He tried to get people in the schools to cook better food, et cetera. Well, that town is going to hit an obesity rate of 50% by the end of the decade. So here's a guy who he desperately believes in, cooking and good food. And he talked to these people and everybody was in tears. But at the end of the day, and he's also not optimistic. As he told me, it's like, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. So
do you think that the additionally the introduction of these GLP-1 medications are going to make people basically more forgiving of bad eating because they feel like it's something that they can get around in terms of just physical appearance, essentially?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a concern. I mean, the real question with that is, as my understanding is, if you stop taking it, you
Yep.
gain back the weight. And so is that something people are going to take for the rest of their lives? And if so, is that affordable? And if so, are there other potential health consequences we don't understand? Yeah, I don't know. I think you, in life, not to get philosophical, in life you have to make a commitment to what you really believe, right? And so for me, one of my deep beliefs is in home cooking for a whole bunch of reasons. My whole life is committed to that. So it's easy for me because I built my life around that. But, if you haven't, a lot of people don't care about it. The convenience of the alternatives is really, and the level of salt and sugar and fat is so addictive, really, that it's hard. You really have to make a commitment to changing what's important to you in your life. And I would say, if you have a family, I would say that the most important thing you could do is cook for your family. And I know that sounds kind of silly and kind of 1960-ish, but I grew up in the 60s, so maybe that's okay. But if you want to do something for your family, cook for them. And that would be the greatest gift probably you could give them, right? It shows you love them. It shows you care. It shows you'll take the time. It shows you care about their health. And when you make your homemade waffles and pancakes and biscuits in the morning on Saturday or Sunday, that's just a moment you'll never get back, really, right? So anyway.
I know that you have been, as you mentioned a couple of times, doing this for a long time and talking about food and thinking about food and thinking about a lot of the issues associated with it in your day-to-day life for your work. What is the one thing, or maybe there's more than one, but what is one thing really well made, could be simple, could be something that isn't simple, that you still look forward to eating?
Oh, it's always apple pie. And the reason I say that is, back in the day, apple pies were made with a variety of apples that all had flavor, right? Like, sheep's nose, Rhode Island greening, et cetera, Corlands. So some of them had more savory flavors. So you had this mix of flavors apples in the supermarket today are all, super sweets. So each pie was a little different and distinctive based on the apples you used. So every time I make apple pie, which is frequently, it's always different because, different varieties of apples, different times a year. So that's one of those dishes where the difference between knowing what you're doing and not makes all the difference in the final result. So that's always my answer is apple pie.
Ice cream, I assume.
No, actually, please. I went years ago to a little place in Cambridge, New York, the Cambridge Hotel, and they claim it was the birthplace of apple pie a la mode because there was this gentleman who come up for the summer and he asked for ice cream on it. I don't know if that's true. Anyway, no, I don't want cheddar on it. I don't want ice cream. I just want it. I just want it the way it is because it's perfect. It's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
It's got the fat. It's got the crust. It's got the apples. Not too much sugar. Please hold the cinnamon. But I love apple pie.
Christopher Kimball is the founder of Milk Street. You can find their recipes, their videos, their books, all for sale on 177milkstreet.com. Thank you so much for taking the time to join the Big Ben Show today.
And it was a nice chat with you. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to a special Thanksgiving edition of the Big Ben Show. Thank you, as always, for following us and interacting at Big Ben Show Fox on X and on Instagram as well. Hopefully, in the comments, you could share something from your own experiences with our subjects today, football and food. But I also wanted to give you a little bit of historical context for this as well. For years now, every time that I host a Thanksgiving edition of my podcast, I've always shared George Washington's Thanksgiving Proclamation, which I think is only apt to consider, especially considering the unique American nature of this holiday. By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor. And whereas both houses of Congress have, by their joint committee, requested me to recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity peaceably to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness. Now, therefore, I do recommend an assigned Thursday, the 26th day of November next, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be, that we may then all unite in rendering unto him our sincere and humble thanks for his kind care and protection of the people of this country, previous to their becoming a nation, for the signal and manifold mercies and the favorable interpositions of his providence, which we experienced in the course and conclusion of the late war, for the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty, which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been enabled to establish constitutions of government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one now lately instituted, for the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed, and the means we have of acquiring and diffusing useful knowledge, and in general, for all the great and various favors which he hath been pleased to confer upon us. And also, that we may then unite in most humbly offering our prayers and supplications to the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech him to pardon our national and other transgressions, to enable us all, whether in public or private stations, to perform our several and relative duties properly and punctually, to render our national government a blessing to all the people, by constantly being a government of wise, just, and constitutional laws, discreetly and faithfully executed and obeyed, to protect and guide all sovereigns and nations, especially such as have shown kindness unto us, and to bless them with good government, peace, and concord, to promote the knowledge and practice of true religion and virtue, and the increase of science among them and us, and generally to grant unto all mankind such a degree of temporal prosperity as he alone knows to be best. Given under my hand in the city of New York, the 3rd day of October, in the year of our Lord, 1789, George Washington. I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. May you have a wonderful time with your families and friends. May you have warm hearths. May you have great food. And may you try, as much as you possibly can, to love all of your relatives despite all of that. You've been listening to another edition of The Big Ben Show. We'll be back next week with more to dive back into the fray.